Hello, my name is Pastor Melissa Malcolm, and I want to welcome you to a summary of our Monday Bible study here at Emory United Methodist Church. Our Bible study is based on Liz Curtis Higgs' idea about bad girls of the Bible, but we're expanding beyond the ones that she covers in this book. We are talking about many of the women in the Bible. We believe that all of us are humans and that all of us have good and negative qualities. We have all sinned and fallen short. So we are looking at these women and how they have excelled in God's presence and how they have failed and what can we learn from those. This week we're talking about Sarah in the Bible, Abraham's wife. And it is not in this book. We are actually looking at there is a summary in this book. It's all the women of the Bible that I'm using as a resource this week. And if you are not with us and would like a copy of some of the materials that we used as a resource, please feel free to reach out to me and I'll be glad to get them to you. Before I forget, we're going to be talking about Rebecca next week. Rebecca is an important character in the Bible, and we'll talk about her being young and her older in her life and how she interacted with her sons. So that's next week is Rebecca, so we hope you'll join us again then. When we look at Sarah in the Bible, she is first mentioned, sorry, I'm having to reach behind me to grab things. She is first mentioned in Genesis 11. She is identified, they're kind of talking about the genealogy where Abram came from. He was named Abram at the time. And it mentions that his son, that Terah took his son Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran, his grandson, and Sarai, his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife. The first time she's mentioned in this book that we value so much. She was a member of the family already, even when she married Abram. At that time, it was not inappropriate for half-siblings to marry each other, and Abram and Sarai were half-brother-sister. So to us, that sounds awful, but in that day and age, it was the case. Remember, we are only 9 generations from Noah at this point. So the repopulation of the world is happening, and marrying within close family is not uncommon. As we are described, we are told right off the bat that they are going on a journey. And in chapter 12 of Genesis, we see the command that God gives. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great. And so you shall be a blessing, and I will bless those who bless you. And the one who curses you, I will curse. And in you, all the families of the earth will be blessed." So we see that the blessing by God here is all for Abram. Does not address Sarai at all, but we believe that she was faithful to him. We don't have any reason to believe that she resisted this change of scenery of leaving everything they know. We do know the next thing that we know about her is that they are on this journey and they go to Egypt where there is a famine. Now, I always think when I hear this next part about Sarai being beautiful, and because of our world standards, I imagine her at 20 or 30 because that's when we think people are the most beautiful. But that is not the beauty that God is identifying here. It is not necessarily just the skin. As someone in Bible study said, I want that skin cream. But it's not just that kind of beauty. It's an inner beauty that Sarai had. Her name, Sarai, means my princess. But her name later was changed to Sarah, which means princess. My princess would have been an identifier for her father naming her this. She is my princess. But later, God changes her name to just be princess, perhaps princess of the king. He claims her as his own. But when she is first described here in chapter 12, verse 10, it says, "Now there was a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there. For the famine was severe in the land. It came about when he came near to Egypt that he said to Sarai his wife, 'See now, I know that you are a beautiful woman. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, "This is his wife," and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that it may go well with me because of you, and that I may live on account of you.'" So here he is. He asks his wife to lie. It's not a full lie because she is his half-sister. But he asks her to lie so that his life may be spared. He doesn't want the Pharaoh to kill him to get to his wife. As a result of that, the Pharaoh takes Sarai from Abram and puts her in his harem. I want you to think about what that means. Abram sacrificed his wife for his safety. Never says that Sarai protested against that. But when it is confronted, God stands in. And it says, the Lord struck Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Then Pharaoh called Abram and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister?" We think about Abram as being so faithful. But at this moment, he was doubting God's protection. There's no other way to explain what happened here is that God protected Sarai. God brought the attention to the Pharaoh that she was not who she had said she was, and protected her. And the Pharaoh gave her back and sent them on their way. A proof of God's protection, even though Abram was not faithful, did not trust that God would take care of him. In moving on, we see that Sarah is a beautiful woman. We see that might make us think that she might be a little self-centered. She might be a little temperamental. She wasn't a perfect woman. None of us are. But moving on, I wanted to point out to you that when she was in Egypt, we believe she was 65 years old. Her beauty was not that of a 20 or 30-year-old. Her beauty was, obviously, she may have been beautiful to look at, but her beauty was deeper than that. In Genesis 16, verse 16, it says, "Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had borne him no children, and she had an Egyptian maid whose name was Hagar." You know, Sarai has been identified as this woman who can't bear children ever since the beginning. Way back in 1129, when she's first identified to us as Abram's wife, it says in verse 30, Sarai was barren. She had no child. This label has been with her for a long time. And that's important. Even today, it is very detrimental to many women who do not have children, who are not able to have children. It is a very hurtful thing. So it is something we can relate to. But Sarai, in this day and age, that was almost her sole purpose, was to bear children. And of course, Abram has been given this wonderful promise by God that his children will number more than the heavens. But it wasn't given to Sarai, it was given to Abram. So as many women do, as many humans do, we think God needs some help. And so in 16:3 said, "After Abram had lived 10 years in the land of Canaan, Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar the Egyptian, her maid, and gave her to her husband Abram as his wife. He went into Hagar, and she conceived. And when she saw that she had conceived, her mistress was despised in her sight. And Sarai said to Abram, 'May the wrong done me be upon you. I gave my maid into your arms, but when she saw that she had conceived, I was despised in her sight. May the Lord judge between you and me.'" Sarai made this choice all on her own. She made the choice that Hagar was the answer, that she needed, her husband was promised children, and since she couldn't give them to her, maybe this was her way in. Now that it's happened, it has elevated Hagar's state. Hagar was a pawn in this, just as Sarai was with Abram. I don't think she did it intentionally to hurt Hagar, but this happens. This is how generational sin happens. Sarai was used in an appropriate way, given to the Pharaoh, and then she chose to do the same thing to Hagar. When Hagar realized that she suddenly had power in this situation and she was elevated, she looked down on her mistress. That's an unfortunate situation, and it's mentioned specifically in the Bible that this is something that does not work. And it is in Proverbs 31. Let me see if I can find that real quick. Proverbs 30, Proverbs 30, verses 21 through 23. It says, "Under three things the earth quakes, and under 4 it cannot bear up. Under a slave when he becomes king, and a fool when he is satisfied with food. Under an unloved woman when she gets a husband, and a maidservant when she supplants her mistress. This was not part of God's plan. God had a plan, and we are going to find out that Sarai was included in the plan. The plan was not just for Abram. But at this point, she was impatient. How many of us have had moments where we know that God's going to show up, but we're impatient with his calling, and we choose to step in and do something on our own? The good news is God forgives us when we are impatient. God helps us out, and he did that here with Sarai as well. The situation with Hagar wasn't good. I'm sure it caused a lot of turmoil in that household. And for 13 years, Sarah had to watch that child, Ishmael, grow up. You know, it hurt her. It was painful for her as she did not have a child. But then we have, and I'm looking for the scripture here, we have God showing up and changing their names. And that is in Genesis 17. God changes Abram's name to Abraham, and he restates the covenant that he has made. I remind you that a covenant is something where whoever is making the covenant does the work. It's not a transaction. A covenant in marriage shouldn't be a transaction. It's one of our problems with marriage today. We promise to love, but we try and make it a transaction. If you're not giving me what I need, then I'm going to withhold what you need. That's not what a covenant is. God made the covenant with Abraham a promise. No matter what Abram and Sarai did, God was going to uphold that covenant. We see that in chapter 17 when he again promises that he will make him the father of a multitude of nations, and that they will have that everlasting covenant. In verse 7 of chapter 17, it says, I will establish my covenant between me and you and your descendants after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your descendants after you. This covenant was made with Israel, a covenant that God would always be our God. We, as the Gentiles who were received by Jesus Christ and invited into this relationship, we were grafted onto that tree. So we also received that covenant. But at this point, God expands the covenant to be clear. First, he just said it was Abram, now Abraham. In verse 15, he says, Then God said to Abraham, As for Sarai, your wife, you shall call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. I will bless her, and indeed I will give you a son by her. Then I will bless her, and she shall be a mother of nations. Kings of people will come from her. I love that God finally includes her, so that there's no doubt whether she is part of this blessing. She's not just Abram's wife. She is part of the blessing. However, he didn't say it to Sarah. He said it to Abraham. And sometimes the translation doesn't make it. There's a difference between God speaking to your husband to tell you something and speaking directly to you. So we wonder, did Sarah really believe it? I hope she did. But we know that we all make mistakes. And I believe that she needed some further proof. She did get her, she needed to hear it herself. So in chapter 18, we see these men coming down the road who Isaac invites to refresh themselves and stay with him. And in verse 9, they say to him, Where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, There in the tent. He said, I will surely return to you at this time next year, and behold, Sarah, your wife, will have a son. And Sarah was listening at the tent door, which was behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. Sarah was past childbearing. Sarah laughed to herself, saying, After I have become old, shall I have pleasure, my Lord being old also? And the Lord said to Abraham, Why did Sarah laugh, saying, Shall I indeed bear a child when I am so old? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you at this time next year, and Sarah will have a son. Sarah denied it, however, saying, I did not laugh, for she was afraid. And he said, No, but you did laugh. An example that God knows everything, inside our minds and inside our hearts. This angel had that information. I love that he says, Is anything too difficult for the Lord? Many of us have been made promises by the Lord, but we are impatient, like Sarah. We want it to happen now in our timing, not God's timing. That's the unfortunate part. But we see here that no matter that Sarah has messed up, no matter that she has jumped the gun and put Hagar in the situation and started a whole nother line to be beyond Abraham, he forgives her. And he realizes she needs to hear it herself. She needs to know that she is part of the promise. You know, God doesn't do that a lot. He doesn't go to individuals very often and say, you're part of the promise. He does it to Mary. He does it to Mary of Magdalene when Jesus comes to find her and says, you go tell the good news. He does it to a few others, but right here in the Old Testament, he makes a special point to go to Sarah and say, you will be the mother of all nations. We really lift up Abraham as our father, but Sarah was named just as important as Abraham. It's important. I don't know what Sarah laughed about, if she laughed in disbelief or she laughed in awesome joy that this was actually going to happen. At this point, she was 90 years old, and Abraham was 100. So it is unbelievable. But it reminds us that our God can do anything. In Genesis 20, Sarah must have still been a beauty, because here they are traveling again in the land of the Negev, and they settled between Kadesh and Shur. And Abraham said to Sarah his wife, she is my sister. So the king of Gerar sent and took Sarah. But God came to the king in a dream of the night and said to him, behold, you are a dead man because of this woman whom you have taken, for she is married. You would think that Abraham would have learned his lesson the first time. But no, he has Sarah claimed to be his sister once again, a 90-year-old beauty who wanted to be claimed by another king. Luckily, God stepped in immediately. Abraham made the mistake again, but God said, no, this is not the way this is going to go. I'm going to protect my Sarah because she is the mother of all nations. So he shut up the wombs of all those in the king's household and let the king know in a dream that this was inappropriate. In chapter 21, it says, then the Lord took note of Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did for Sarah as he had promised. So Sarah conceived and bore a son to Abraham in his old age at the appointed time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore to him, Isaac. Then Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh with me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children? Yet I have borne him a son in his old age. The child grew and was weaned, and Abraham made a great feast on that day that Isaac was weaned. Sarah finally got her wish. She finally got the thing that had been promised to her. That's amazing. You would think everything would be perfect. But unfortunately, she was a human. She had watched Ishmael grow for 13 or 14 years. And the very next verse, 21:9, it says, now Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. In other translations, it specifically implies that he was mocking his little brother who'd just been weaned. He would have been 2 or 3. What teenage boy of 14 wouldn't make fun of his little brother who's 2 or 3? But it offended Sarah. She was tired of it. She didn't want to be in competition anymore. She wanted them gone. And she demanded that Abraham set them out into the desert. I'm grateful for a God that did not punish Hagar for something that was not in her control. He protected Hagar and Ishmael, even though this was not God's plan. And I am grateful for that. Maybe Sarah was harsh. Who knows? Maybe her behavior was really harsh. But she is a human being and makes mistakes. But we still look back at her as our spiritual mother. She is faithful to Abraham. She is faithful. She follows behind him. She tries to do whatever she can to give him the promise that God has promised. That's the mistake, though. We're not in control. God is, and we have to be patient. Sarah is held up by the disciples later on as a wonderful example of what a woman should be, that she should be beautiful on the inside, not necessarily on the out. It's not about the adornments, it's about the spirit. But it also talks about Sarah's submission to Abraham, which is important. But unfortunately, 1 Peter 3 has been taken out of context many times. It says, "In the same way, you wives, be submissive to your own husbands, so that even if any of them are disobedient to the word, they may be won without a word by the behavior of their wives." Unfortunately, this has been used to keep women in abusive situations. And I want to say right now, that is not the case. That is not what God intends. God intends for us to be in an equal partnership, a partnership that helps each other. We are to be submissive to each other. We are not to be selfish about our wants, but think about our partner's wants just as much. If you read verse 1, you also have to read verse 7 when it says, "You husbands, in the same way, live with your wives in an understanding way as with someone weaker, since she is a woman, and show her honor as a fellow heir of the grace of life, so that your prayers will not be hindered." I want you to understand that Abraham was the father. He is the father of many nations. We can point back to him and say he is one of our human fathers. But Sarah was also our human mother. God could have used Hagar, but he didn't. He chose Sarah, and he kept true to his promise, even though she was 90 years old. It says here on verse 5 of chapter 3 in 1 Peter, "For in this way, in former times, the holy women also who hoped in God used to adorn themselves, being submissive to their own husbands, just as Sarah obeyed Abraham, calling him Lord, and you have become her children, if you do what is right without being frightened by any fear." I'm sure there were times that Abraham and Sarah were afraid. I'm sure they thought that God had forgotten them. If you are in that situation today, I want you to hear the promise. God knows who you are, knows where you are, and has not forgotten you. God loves all of his children, his princes and his princesses. Sarah lived a long life. She died at 127. Abraham mourned her. He wanted to bury her well, insisted on paying for the property where he buried her, and he thought of her for a good long time. But later on, it did say Abraham remarried and had many more children. So the line of many nations of Abraham came true, not just through his son Ishmael, but through his sons that came from his other wife. That is in chapter 25 of Genesis. It says, "Now Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Joshan, Medan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua." These are the other lines, the other nations of Israel. Abraham had many descendants, but Sarah was our mother. So I hope that as you study the story of Sarah, you can hear how God never deserted her, never forgot her. She was faithful to Abraham when she didn't know to be faithful to God. And over time, she became faithful to God. Next week, we're going to be talking about Rebecca, so I hope you can join us then. You're always welcome to join us on Mondays. We have Bible study usually from 10 to 11:30 a.m. at Emory United Methodist Church. If you have questions, please let me know. If you would like the material that we're using as our basis for Rebecca, please drop me a message and we'd be glad to get it to you. But above all, we hope that you are blessed. Let me pray for you. Gracious God, anyone who's taken the time to watch this, please bless them. Bless them with more knowledge of you. Bless them to explore these topics that we brought up. We had great conversation in our discipleship class this morning, and I hope it blessed all of us. God, it's a conversation. We learn from each other. We learn from each other's experiences, and these communities and these times of studying your word help draw us closer to you. And we want to be very close to you right now, God, so that when Easter comes, we can be the first to celebrate the resurrection that you have promised all of us. Thank you, God, for this time, for this technology, and anyone who is listening to this. Bless them and keep them. Have a blessed day, and reach out to us if we can be a blessing to you.